Okay, welcome everybody. We can see you coming into the room. Yeah, if everybody could keep their mics off.
I'm in here, otherwise.
Yeah, hello, welcome everybody. Really good to see you coming into our virtual room. It's just going to give it another minute. Okay, so welcome to this webinar on securing, analysing and framing research for impactful campaigning from all of us at the PRCA's charity and non-profit group, and from our speakers, Emma Stroud, Campaigns and Marketing Manager at the Metropolitan Police, Ben Verinder, Founder and Director of Chalkstream PR, and Tamsyn Hyatt, Principal Comms Strategist at Frameworks. And if you don't know me, I'm Dr. Nikki Garston, Associate Professor of Business and NGO Communications at the University of Greenwich. And I'm co-chairing this session with Paige Patrick, Digital Communications Manager at the Media Trust. And hello, yes, if you could turn mics off, please, that would be really helpful. And we're beginning with a look at research that underpinned the Met Police's and Crime Stoppers campaign, Hard Calls Save Lives, that won 3 PRCA awards for best use of planning, research and evaluation, public sector value for money, and the Broadcast Award. Emma Stroud is going to share the research conducted to identify and shift barriers to behavioural change for this campaign. So a bit of housekeeping, please put any comments and questions in the chat, and Paige will identify themes for the Q&A session at the end. And of course, we'd love to see you on camera for the Q&A. So let's welcome our first speaker, Emma Stroud.
Hello, everyone. I think Kira is going to very kindly share my slides because I've had a few technical issues. So this is a campaign that we conducted called Hard Calls Save Lives. And today I'm going to be talking about the research that we did to identify and shift barriers to behavioural change. So the problem that we're trying to solve with this is that we know that people can be reluctant to report what they know about knife crime. Could we go on to the next slide, please? What do we want to change? We want to move people, and women in particular, as we know women are a good audience for this campaign, closer to a point where they would consider reporting knife crime to Crime Stoppers. Now, this deliberately isn't a Met-fronted campaign because we know that there's mistrust of the Met Police that is a long-standing problem and requires long-term change to improve. So we've partnered with Crime Stoppers, who are a completely independent charity where you can report crime information absolutely anonymously. So if you look at the slide, we've used a very basic behavioural change model, and I'm told that there's 19 different behavioural change models out there. So this is awareness, knowledge, intention and action. And for this campaign, we were really concentrating on improving awareness, knowledge and intention, rather than necessarily expecting people to pick up the phone straight away and call Crime Stoppers. So if we could go on to the next slide, please. And I'll move on to the research. So in order to change behaviour, we first really need to understand it. And we need to know why people are behaving how they are. Why aren't they reporting knife crime intelligence? And what needs to happen for that to change? So our audience for this campaign were people living in 11 London boroughs with a high incidence of knife crime, and particularly women from a lower socioeconomic background, aged 18 to 25, who are relatives of those at risk of knife crime. There could be mothers, sisters or cousins. What do we want to know? We want to know what women's awareness and knowledge of what crime intelligence is currently and how it helps to detect and prevent crime. potential motivators that could encourage female family influencers to share crime intelligence, and we want to know barriers to sharing information. So that was a qualitative piece of research that an agency carried out on our behalf, and they conducted it in 4 hotspots because they couldn't cover the whole of those 11 boroughs. Okay, if I could have the next slide, please. So this is what women know. This is what we found out during the research. And something that we know about intelligence or information that people generally didn't was that small pieces of information can make a huge piece of difference. They can make a huge difference to detectives. For example, you know, if you know what time a drug deal took place, or you've seen something that looks unusual, you've seen a car driving off at speed, for example, and that information is then put together like a jigsaw puzzle to solve a crime. But if you are looking at our audience, they really thought you had to be a victim or you had to be a witness, you perhaps needed to name names, and they saw intelligence sometimes as a collection of data, so sort of information about the local community, local crime rates. And that's not exactly what we mean by information or intelligence. Interestingly, it wasn't seen, and this is a key piece of insight for us, it wasn't seen in the context of crime prevention or saving or safeguarding lives. Rather, it was more seen as, you know, sort of snitching on people. So that's part of what we found out. If we just move on to the next slide, I'm going to talk about barriers and potential motivators. So here we go with barriers: mistrust of the police, perceived discrimination by police and the justice system, fear of repercussions for yourself and your family, negatively affecting someone's long-term future. In other words, young boys can grow out of criminal behaviour, so people didn't want to affect them. They thought that it won't make a difference, nothing will change. And then conversely, motivators, building trust, being heard, seeing a difference, and doing the right thing. So looking at those in the round, what could we do something about? Well, I've put arrows next to the ones that we could do something about. So fear of repercussions for the self and family. That's about building confidence in the anonymity of Crime Stoppers. Won't make a difference, nothing will change. That's about understanding information, what happens to it and how it's used. And then when you look at the motivators, building trust, again, that's about building confidence in the anonymity of Crime Stoppers. Seeing a difference, that's about understanding information again and what happens to it and how it's used. And doing the right thing, that comes back to the point I made earlier about the way that information is seen. So it's seen as like you're saving lives. In fact, the campaign's called Hardcall Save Lives rather than sort of snitching. So reframing the narrative on that, I suppose. Could I have the next slide, please? Oh, that's the one. Okay, so going back to the behaviour change slide that I showed, what we're trying to do is increase awareness, knowledge and intention to report. So you'll see that these objectives link back to that behavioural model. So it's raising awareness of Crime Stoppers as a means of reporting information, changing attitudes towards believing that Crime Stoppers is anonymous, knowing what information to share and understanding what happens to information. So increasing willingness to report information to Crime Stoppers in order to prevent knife crime. So normally with objectives, you need to increase it by a certain percentage. And it was difficult really to know what percentage to pick, to be honest, because it's sometimes just difficult to predict. But we were looking about 5% from a baseline survey that was conducted among 500 women, so that we know what the baseline is of all these things. And then after the campaign, we measured that again to see what the difference was. If we could move on to the next slide. So I don't know if the one on the left should be a sort of mini video, but it doesn't matter if it doesn't work. But these, I thought I'd show you briefly the creatives that we produced for this. We had 2 phases of the campaign, and both of these phases contained behavioural change techniques. So phase 1, the technique that we employed was education. So we were looking at social assets. We sent out social assets, explaining what information is, what happens to information, and addressing concerns about anonymity, which you'll see on the left. Now, phase 2, we used the technique of persuasion or incentivization. So we developed assets sharing the hard-hitting mother stories, and you'll see all of our mothers here in the pictures. So our mothers described on video the hardest call they had to make after their son's death. And the connection was calling with knife crime information may feel hard, but they're harder calls that you could be making. So quite hard-hitting stuff. And again, that's using a behavioural change technique, persuasion and incentivization. Now, if we could go on to the next slide. So going back to the objectives that I discussed, this is where we got to. And that survey that we did before and after the campaign allowed us to evaluate the impact that we'd had on all of those areas. So we saw that 48% of people are aware of Crime Stoppers as a means of reporting. That was an increase of 9%. In terms of changing attitudes, we got 23% agreement with the statement Crime Stoppers is anonymous. We got 12% agreement with any small piece of information provided to Crime Stoppers can be useful. And under understanding what happens to information, then 19% said they had a clear understanding of what happened when they reported it. And we had a 13% of increase of people saying they were willing to report information to Crime Stoppers in the future. So that was very encouraging. And if I could just move on to my final slide. Now, as I explained at the beginning of the presentation, we didn't really expect that people would necessarily take action as a result of one campaign alone, because beliefs about sharing information, the fact that seen as snitching were quite entrenched, I suppose, understandably so. But of course, we did track action. The main problem, I'm afraid, is that due to the anonymity of calls and the online forms that you could fill in, having seen the campaign, we couldn't directly connect them to specific actions taken by the police because they were anonymous, so we couldn't track them through. But what we do know is that during the campaign period, which was September 2020 to May 2021, we saw a 9.5 increase in actionable reports, and that was against a COVID background. So we were pleased with that. And most of the 11 boroughs that I spoke about recorded an increase in calls over the period. Plus, there were 58,000 visits to the Hard Calls Save Lives website between March 2021 and March 2022. So that was also great. So I guess the point that I want to make in conclusion with all of this is that really, without properly understanding the audience, their barriers and their motivations, I think it's very difficult to get a really comprehensive strategy together. And I'm not sure that the campaign would have been as good as it has been. And I did continually throughout this campaign keep referring back to that research. So it was worth its weight in gold. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Emma, for a fascinating presentation about research for behavioural change and for showing that impact on the behaviour. We're now going to hear from Ben Verinder, who was previously Communications Director at the NGO Association of Colleges, and he's going to talk about formative research to inform campaigns, how to make the most of free sources of information, and your own data sets. So, welcome, Ben.
Thank you ever so much. Can you see my slides okay, Lily?
Yes.
Great. So, my name is Ben Verinder. I'm the MD of a research organisation predominantly, so reputation research and reputation management. So most of our clients are either in the education or third sector. So we do quite a lot of primary research for charities around the world, mostly on vision, mission, values, so what you might call constituted public relations. So I'm just going to give you 15 minutes. I'm going to give you lots of free stuff. I'm going to try and take you through some sources of information related to formative research in designing a campaign. So my focus here is really on that background research that you would do, that situation analysis part before you develop your objectives, goals, and then your strategy, tactics and evaluation. So this is the sort of the kick-off part of a campaign, really. We'll start with something called Nomis. So Nomis is really a portal to information provided by the Office for National Statistics. You can Google it, www.nomis.co.uk, and its focus in terms of data sources are population data sets. So things like the census. There was a new one out in 2021. That's just the data for that has just been published through Nomis, and obviously the previous ones they were every decade. So it was 2011, the previous one, but also things like the annual population survey and the labour force survey, and a variety of other, particularly economic and business-based surveys. It's free; you don't have to pay anything, and there is also, if you don't find what you want in Nomis first time around, there's a social studies team that you can contact. You Google them and find their contact details, and they're also on the Nomis pages. And they will either point you to whether a study like yours has ever been done before, so for free, or they can actually produce a bespoke study for you, and there will be a cost for that. But they are brilliant and incredibly helpful. So what's the kind of stuff that's on there that I'm talking about? This stuff. So anything related to populations, really, in the United Kingdom. There is a focus on England, but most of the data is UK wide. So let's have a think about how you might use this as a charity. Well, for instance, if you are a charity that's looking to develop a campaign to move people from cars to, let's say, bikes in a city area, for instance, this data will allow you to understand how many people own on average per household, how many cars do they own, and how many bikes do they own. So you might have a bike ownership issue. You might be developing a campaign that's focusing on the dependence of lone parents, or on the children of single parents, extra support for them, for instance, maybe promoting promoting a subsidy or a welfare scheme, and you can see how useful this would be. But you name it, if you've got a population inquiry in relation to a campaign, this is the place to start. Anything from an education campaign to qualification development, through to something where you might be targeting a particular population in relation to ethnicity, country of origin, etc., or passport holders even. I'm sure you can all think of different ways you might want to use this for formative research. Next one I'll just mention is Ofcom. This is a fantastically useful source of information for understanding the media use of your target audience in any campaign. So Ofcom produces a series of annual reports on media use according to adults, but also children, so which they classify as age 15 and under. And they have all sorts of specialist reports of this kind of type. They also do lots of analysis of different parts of the media market. So it's not just media use, but also how different media companies are faring. There's a gentleman called Dan Slee, who you could find on Twitter, who does a brilliant regular analysis of these and summary of these papers if you want a bite-sized version. But if you're going into these kind of reports, this is the kind of things you can find. So it's not just a traditional media, but what's the most common social media channels used by 15-year-olds in the west of England or in a particular city region? What do we want from our social media companies in terms of technological regulation and moderation? What particular technology do we use in terms of media use? And how long do we spend on a particular channel? So this is particularly useful, obviously, if you're thinking, right, we've got a target audience of X, what channel shall we use in order to best, particularly digital, but it's all different types of media, including newspapers, what channels shall we use in order to make sure that we connect with them and communicate effectively? Next one I'll mention is an attitudinal study. It's called the British Social Attitude Study. It's been going since 1983. Typically, there are about 3,000 respondents in each round. Each round happens every year. It's weighted in order to represent the population of, in terms of proportions of respondents, to represent the population of the United Kingdom. And it's run by the National Centre for, it's called NatCen. Can't remember. I think National Centre for Research, I think it's called. Now, because it's been going for so long, it's also got lots of trends over time. So why would you use this? Well, if you've got a campaign where you're trying to benchmark attitudes of a target market, so if you want to change people's attitudes in particular, or awareness, or even sometimes behaviours, because there's some behavioural stuff in here, then this is a great place to go to see if there's free benchmarking information about what does this group, or what does Britain in particular think of X topic, and you name it, again, it's there. Now these topics tend to be contemporaneous. They tend to be those things that are bubbling to the surface. Well, it's a two-part survey actually. The first part tends to be topics that are very topical. So in any given year, so last year it was Brexit, COVID, but also there tends to be trends over time. So it's the second part tends to be more as a longitudinal. So again, lots of things to look in there, and you can find a huge amount of information on topics that might be related to your campaign. You can use those as benchmarks to understand how far you need to shift people as part of your campaign planning, and inform the targets that you're going to set for your campaign. Some others, free stuff that you might want to think about. So the British Polling Council, I've put this link here because essentially the British Polling Council is a consortium, is a membership group, actually better way of describing it, for pollsters and survey companies. Now on that site, you'll find links to the websites of all of those companies. So if you go to the members section that I've linked there, you'll find the link to Ipsos, YouGov, Comres, all these survey companies. Now, why am I mentioning this? Because each has a ridiculously big, well, most have a ridiculously big library of past studies. So a bit like the NatCen British Social Attitude Study, it's a brilliant resource for benchmarking awareness, attitudes, and sometimes behaviour. But the problem is, I'm afraid, that there's no central library or search entity. So you do have to go into each one and try and find a study that might correspond to your particular campaign, whether it's fire protection through to sexual health, whatever it is, and there's stuff in there. Google Trends, I'm sure you're aware of it, but essentially these are the search habits, and you can change this by geography. It's UK based, but you can also go down to particular regions, and essentially it's a great way of looking at what's popular, as a proxy for awareness of particular topics. And you can see also in Google Trends the kind of issues that people associate with a given topic. So if I was a climate change NGO and I wanted to understand what topics people associate with, or let's say forest fires, to be topical, then it will show me the kind of terms that people use in association with that particular topic. Lots more to it, but have a play around if you've never used it before. But again, for formative research, I find it, particularly when it's secondary research, incredibly useful. Answer the Public is essentially it uses Google search algorithms as a basis for its programming, but essentially it gives you lots of information on the kind of questions people ask on a particular topic. If you are devising a campaign, it's hugely useful for powering your messaging, so that you are using the kind of phraseology and terminology that people use and associate with a particular topic. Suval is a a cracking search engine that shows you results or search topicality by a range of different search engines, including Wikipedia, YouTube, Amazon, answers.com, and a variety of others. So in other words, it's a one-stop shop for finding out the kind of things people use these different search engines for in relation to a topic. And again, it can provide a huge amount of detailed information for helping you design a campaign and making sure that your messaging is appropriate. And there are, I'm sure you know, lots of other tools you can use to devise and develop campaign design in terms of understanding what people are interested in, understanding their awareness relative to other topics, and the kind of terminology and messaging they associate with a given topic. So lastly, very quickly, I'll just talk you through how to use your own data and make the most out of your own data. So we do quite a lot of research on behalf of charities, in particular NGOs, where we might be applying or using their own proprietary data. So we might be doing research amongst donors or funders or service users. And if that's the kind of campaign that you are, a sort of internally focused or stakeholder focused campaign, and you're going to be using your own data, just a few hints and tips really. Obviously, in terms of topicality, could be service users or volunteers or advocates. It could be, you could be looking at service delivery trends, so improving your activity or effectiveness as a organization, or again, it might be fundraising focused. It will depend upon the data that's within your database. The mains issue that I would raise in relation to secondary research like this, or any use of your own data of this type, is what goes in must come out. So it's all to do with the quality of the data within a CRM or similar. Obviously, it's affected by GDPR considerations, and do bear these in mind. The biggest issue that we have with our clients, I have to say, is that is the quality of the data within their databases, and segmentation in particular. So the problems that they have with segmentation. And lastly, just to give you some ideas about some primary research that you might undertake in relation to your own stakeholders. So in other words, data that you've already accessed yourself. That could be anything from what they want from you as a partner, if they're a broader external stakeholder or supporter. It could be, again, as I mentioned before, constituted public relations to inform your mission and values. It could be fundraising related or communications preferences, or anything from how much a particular group would like to advocate on your behalf. So I've sort of come to the end of my section there. Thanks for listening. Just to give you a sort of whet your appetites about what you can do with other people's data and what you can do with your own data.
Thank you, Ben, for such practical guidance, and it's going to be fantastic to have that resource up on the PRCA website, and everybody's going to be sent a copy of this presentation. If you've got any questions, do please pop them in the chat. And we're now going to move to Tamsyn Hyatt, Principal Communications Strategist at Frameworks, the organisation that specialises in the reframing of social issues. So welcome, Tamsyn.
Thank you so much, Nikki, and hello everyone. Glad to be sat around the virtual table with you. To give you a quick intro to Frameworks, we spend our time researching two things: how people think about an issue, and then what changes those things. The approach we take is multidisciplinary in nature, so we draw from psychological anthropology, sociology, linguistics, and the cognitive sciences. And then we take our research, our insights, and work in partnership with mission-driven organizations for social change. On screen are just a few of the organizations we've worked with over the last few years. In the UK, we've focused on 3 areas: economic justice, children and families, and health inequality, but also gender, climate, and a few others. What unites all of these organizations and the campaigners and communicators we've worked with globally over the last 20 years is the desire to change the world. And there are 3 ways to change the world with social issue campaigns. We can change behavior, stop smoking, get moving, opt in for pensions and organ donation. We can change awareness of a problem that exists that needs our attention, and about it, donate time, money, share a symbol. Or we can change context, create structural, systemic, or policy change, like smoke-free workplaces under the 2006 Health Act, or provide free tobacco treatment services for all smokers under the 2019 NHS long-term plan. So we have 3 ways to change the world: change behavior, change awareness, and change context. Now, there will be some nuance and overlap here, but in the interest of time, I'm going to keep our distinction clear and focus only on the 3rd of these, changing context. Because framing research is all about how we build understanding, how we invite people in to create collective responses to social issues. Framing is how we can change the structures, the systems, and the policies that need it. So, what is framing? It is as simple as making choices about how we present information, how we tell our story. It is what we emphasize, how we explain an issue, and what we leave unsaid. And these choices are powerful because when we get them right, when we're able to base our choices on really rigorous evidence, they can create radical changes in how people think, feel, and act. When we change the story, we can change the world. And not every framing choice is helpful to this end. We've seen this over the last 2 years in the narrative and the messaging that has come out of the pandemic and the effect that this has had on public thinking. Like calls to protect the elderly and the vulnerable in the early stages of the pandemic, used to talk about shielding, masking, lockdown, with 2 really predictable results. Firstly, that the preface, that distinction between the elderly, the young, the vulnerable, and the robust, that made the pandemic to the young and the robust about other people, with a negative impact on support for universal lockdown policies. And second, that backfire effect on the target audience, with many over 50s keen to prove that they were fit and healthy. Boris Johnson asked us to exercise personal responsibility for COVID precautions back in February, with a likewise predictable response, one that you may have seen on public transport this morning, that we don't need to follow expert guidance, government guidance anymore. We're fine. And it's now that much harder to make the case for pandemic-specific government support. Finally, the claim that nature is healing thanks to the lockdown, shared widely on social, often combined with vivid pictures of the natural world reclaiming space. This was a celebration, but one with a consequence, because it ended up feeding into a narrative that is already out there and already used by opponents of green policies, that tackling climate change is just not compatible with living our lives. So not every framing choice, every story told is helpful, but so many of them are. All of these images represent big campaign moments and movements from the last few years across the US, the UK, Ireland, and the world. All of these campaigns used framing and framing research to mobilize people around a very particular story, one that drove people's attention to systems and to context, one that showed why collective action mattered, what they were for. It mattered because of love and family, because of our right to a safe workspace, because we show compassion to fellow human beings that live on our street, because we can find solutions that will repair our planet. All of these campaigns used framing to change how people think and at scale. And I'd argue this is what we need to happen on so many social issues if we are to make the change we need in time for it to make a difference. So with that in mind, and with an eye on time, I'm going to share 2 or 3 ways to use framing research for social change, some learnings, some insights from our own research that cut across issue areas, that are not the only way to create effective campaigns, but are part of the picture and will hopefully add some more impact to the work that you're already doing. Our first insight: stand for something. All too often, we make our case for change by talking about all of the things we're against: anti-discrimination, stopping fossil fuels, stopping the war, ending violence against women. And when we really care about an issue, it is natural to want to talk about how bad things are, to campaign against how bad things could be. But all of our research across issue areas shows us that this is not enough, especially when we are facing one crisis after another, because when everything is a crisis, nothing is. People experience crisis fatigue, we burn out, or we become so terrified that we lose the ability to meaningfully engage on the issue. Problems become salient, but too big to solve. So people shut down and disengage. This is not to say that there is no crisis, there are no problems for us to fight against, there absolutely are. It is to say that our diagnosis of a problem is not and cannot be the same as our communications strategy. It's not enough to point out problems. We need to give people more. We need to pair problems with our ability to fix them, to talk about the urgency and severity of what is happening now without losing sight of what we have to gain by putting things right. To give an example from our quant research on framing child obesity, one of the ways in which we do frame testing is essentially a randomized control trial. We ask a set of questions to sample groups after exposure to a frame alongside a control group, that thick black line at 0 who hear nothing. And when people were given a message framed as against child obesity, that there's a problem, we need to reduce it, here is what happened. No statistically significant impact on people's support for policy change or their belief that society must act. Across these 2 metrics, it was the same as saying nothing at all. But when people were given that same message framed as improving child health, something we are all for, here is what happened. It primed a collective response, support for policy change and support for the belief that society must act. And here is how this has been used and made change in our world, with the campaign group Bite Back 2030, along with others, securing government promises to protect and improve child health by restricting junk food advertising. Second insight, second learning from the research is to bring systems change to life. We know that tackling so many social issues means acting at scale, making change at scale. But people have a tendency to think very deterministically about the way our world works, especially the big things like economies and industries. People think that this is just how things are, our systems and conditions are big or too complex to change. Our research across lots of different issues tells us that we can override this tendency by bringing systems change to life, by showing how things can change deliberately and intentionally. This is NHS England's take on obesity, on obesogenic environments and the problem factors that can cause someone to overeat. Anyone understand what's going on here, how this works, or what needs to change? We can do things differently, frame things differently. I have an example here, one taken from some of our research and mobilization work over in the US. I'm going to share it with the caveat that it is culturally specific to America. There'll be some references there. But it's designed to make the case for systems change, to frame the need for more support for children and families in the early years. Here we go.
This is Zoe. She's 1, and she's running for president. Because if she's cared for, kept safe, and has a chance to learn and grow, then she could lead our great nation in, like, 50 years. Help kids like Zoe dream big. The why, for early learning, childcare, mentorship, and more. For a better us.
So I love this campaign because Zoe is adorable, engaging, shareable. And she also tells a systems story. The systems and supports that are necessary for Zoe to thrive, like childcare, mentorship, early learning, are all explicitly named and connected to her potential for growth. This ad brings in the bigger picture in a way that feels both doable and desirable. Of course, we want a better us. And what this all comes down to is this, that when we understand how something works, when it's brought to life in ways that are meaningful and understandable, we support solutions more. This is something that holds true across every issue that we've worked on at Frameworks. It's not enough to tell people to look up. We need to get people thinking about agency, possibility, the idea that systems are designed and can be redesigned to meet our needs. This metaphor, design, redesign, is one that we've tested and developed at Frameworks across a few different issue areas to do just this. So we're not limited to these exact words. We could talk about build, rebuild, model, remodel, program, reprogram. These words all help overcome naturalism and fatalism. They all help people see that systems can and should be made to work differently. Quick quant example, again, from our work on framing poverty and that randomized control trial. When people were given a message about benefits that just asserted that our benefit system was broken and needed to be fixed, here's what happened. No statistically significant shift. However, when people were given that same message framed with a metaphor, an explanatory device to help people understand how our benefit system could and should work, here is what happened. Explanation primed a collective response, a belief that society must act, and a belief that that action would make a difference. And again, here's how this has been used to make change in our world. Marcus Rashford securing free school meal vouchers during the summer, in part by calling out a system that wasn't built for families like his. So we needed to rebuild it, and we could. And the fantastic Keep the Lifeline campaign across the poverty sector, extending the currents metaphor from our work on framing poverty to secure changes to universal credit that amounted to an annual investment of 2 to 3 billion. Final insight before I stop, to normalize action, not inaction. So our work tells us that our perceptions of what other people are or are not doing really matters. There's been a lot of research on framing social norms. Betsy Pallack is amazing on this one. The LSE published something recently that found lockdown compliance was influenced less by concern about catching the virus and more by our concern that other people would disapprove if we didn't follow the rules. All this to say, what we perceive as normal, what we perceive as possible, shapes what we think and what we do. But all too often, we make our case for change with campaign by calling out inaction. Top left, the infamous Keep America Beautiful ad showing us how normal it is not to recycle or to bin our litter. Top right, Wikipedia telling us that 98% of readers don't give. Tube passengers not wearing masks. And in March, 1 in 3 middle-aged Britons not saving enough for retirement. And I don't know about you, but when I read that last pensions headline, I thought, phew, it's not just me. My behavior, my inactivity is fine. Because with this paradigm, with this framing, no one is acting. Doing nothing is normal. One of the biggest threats we are facing on so many social issues is not denial, it's inactivity and indifference. And the way to counter this is not to rail against it, it's to channel efficacy, our ability to produce a desired or intended result. Efficacy is not hope and it's not optimism. These two things are necessary, but ultimately they're both passive. Efficacy is our collective ability to act and to get things done. And our research indicates how necessary it is to channel this, to talk about how things can change, that people want change, and that we're making it already. And this does two things. It helps us to tip that social norm in favor of action. And it's countering the fatalism that can cause people to switch off and disengage in a crisis. And here's how a few of us are doing this already in our world. The Guardian, the people's voice is clear, they want action. The FT on big businesses, soon to only be using renewables. The Resolution Foundation, talking about how renewable generation is already cutting bills by 15 to 20 pounds per year. EU Commission, bottom right, and my current favorite, top right, channeling both efficacy and social norms. Offshore wind in Australia is generating loads of power and loads of jobs. From our climate research in particular, but across different issue areas, this is what we need to be doing more of. More of this, and more of things like this. This is the start of a very long thread by a man called Mike Fell of heat pumps that look like George Clooney. Heat pumps that are necessary to tackle climate change, but also heat pumps that are dapper, heat pumps that are unexpected, and heat pumps that are utterly, utterly normal to have, to the point where it becomes odd if you don't have one. This is where we need to get to for so many different social issues, for action to be our norm. And with an eye on the time, I am going to stop there, but I am going to say, if you want to find out more about framing existing issues, the research that's out there, take a look at our website. It is on screen here. Connect with us on Twitter, or in particular, explore our Framing 101 series. Lots of different articles for you to find out more, get involved. Thanks for having me.
Wow, thank you so much. That was absolutely a brilliant presentation, and we've just heard from 3 incredible speakers. So thank you all so much for that. Well, I think time now is for questions. So is there anyone who would like to come off mute and maybe ask their question? I know I saw a few in the chat, so if any of those people would be happy to maybe come off mute now and ask, that would be great. If not, I can raise them. I'll give you a couple of seconds.
I was going to say, I think my question was actually then a bit answered by the second half of your presentation. I think the fact that, you know, you spelt it out so nicely that I said, if we help people understand, then you know, there's a chance for them to engage and buy in. And I think the flip side for me is, if we push rules or guidance and we don't help people understand, we shouldn't expect people to comply or to follow, because I guess we don't understand, you know, their context and the stuff we're missing as well. So yeah, I think my question was answered. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Did anyone else want to come off mute? I'm going to take that as a no for now, but I have seen a few questions in the chat, so I'll just bring a few of them up. So one from Nina. She said, do any of the speakers have examples of where research has been used versus where it hasn't, and how much more effective a campaign is where it is used, either to inform the campaign strategy or in the storytelling and messaging? So does anyone have any examples of where research has been used and it's created a so much more impactful campaign?
Yeah, I've got loads. So if you have a look at awards entries tend to be quite a good one. So things like PRCA awards, but also CIPR Excellence Awards. And if you have a look at, I'm thinking of an RSPCA campaign last year, I think, most of those that will be awards winners will be research driven. And somebody else in the chat talked about common issues with campaigns. They're generally about unclear objectives. And if we're not using research to power and design our campaigns, then we often will be developing objectives that are either unrealistic or that are woolly and not precise enough, and perhaps not even smart, specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, time-bound, etc. So yeah, I would loads and loads of ones, but those that tend to be award winners are always, often really good sources of understanding the impact of the formative research.
Thank you, Ben. Yeah, no, that's a really good idea to check out some award winners. Another question that we had was about how you make sure the research that you're doing isn't biased towards your existing opinions or organizational policy or assumptions. Does anyone have any comments on that?
The risk of being, unless anybody wants to, just to say that, that often that's about weighting. So when we talk about weighting, we mean sampling. So, if you are looking to change the attitude of a target audience, for instance, or a particular group, whether it's current stakeholders or service users, for instance, or the wider general public, and then that group the people that so let's say you're doing some primary research, you're surveying people to help design a campaign, you must make sure that that group is representative of the population under study. In other words, that it is adequately and statistically representative of the people that you're trying to target. So for instance, if it's single mothers in Droitwich, then you must make sure that the demographics of the people that you're surveying to inform your campaign, for instance, is representative of that particular group. So you need to understand the demography.
Thank you, Ben. Yeah, Emma or Tamsyn, did you have anything that you would want to add to that?
Not really. I think you've covered it. Thanks, Ben.
Thank you.
I was dropping in my favorite example of a framed unframed campaign into the chat. So Children's Hearing Scotland were one of our early adopters when we were conducting research on framing care experience, and you can see a kind of clear shift in how they approached recruitment for members of the Children's Hearings panel, moving away from the sense of damage done, of individual heroism, of kind of narrowing down problems to the level of the individual, and instead thinking much more contextually about the shared skills that panel members could bring to the table. And for anyone who wants more, I've got details of the increased numbers of sign-ups for the second campaign, particularly amongst younger audiences. There was a particular target for this one, but it's in the chat for anyone who wants it.
And just to speak to Tamsyn's points about framing and behavioural science, you talked about social norms. I mean, that is so fundamental. For instance, let's say litter and environmental effects. So the underpinning study for one of the earliest studies in this is Robert Cialdini's work on behavioural science related to litter. It's a personal passion, and I work for a variety of different charities in this area. And the social norms, in other words, what we say about what other people do in related to littering, is incredibly fundamental to any campaign around this particular area, for instance. So just that kind of stuff that Tamsyn is talking about is absolutely essential, I would suggest, in informative research as well.
Thank you both for that. Yeah, I think we've probably just got time for one more question. And I sort of had one, and Sam, I know you sort of had one sent in as well, and they kind of align maybe a little bit. But I'm thinking in terms of, we have a lot of small charities probably on the call and in the charity industry, and when when you're getting started, sort of where do you start, and do you have any tips for securing the budget you would need in order to get the research done?
From our perspective, we love working in coalitions. So often the research that we do is funded by groups of charities who've come together, who are talking about, say, homelessness or care experience or poverty, and want to draw on some shared research and resource in that space. And this is even better for us because it means that when we look to mobilize the research, we have lots of different organizations and lots of different spaces ready to jump on that insights. We also share all of our research, all of our work on our website. So if there is an issue area where you're working on it and we've done the research, go to our website, it will be there. And I'm always happy to talk framing and framing research with anyone.
That's brilliant. Yeah, I love sharing research, love sharing insights and all of that. Well, thank you so much. I think that's pretty much on time and all we have time for today. I just want to say a huge thank you to all of our speakers. Emma, hearing from the insights you had who informed the Crime Stoppers campaign was super powerful. Ben, your overview of the free resources that people can use will be just so helpful to all of us, including me. And Tamsyn, your presentation really hammered home the importance of framing. So yeah, once again, a big thank you to all of our speakers, and thank you so much for all of you for joining us too. We'll have another event coming up soon. I think the date is penciled in for the 15th of September. So keep an eye out on the PRCA channels for that. And yeah, have a great day, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks very much.